Okay, so good afternoon already, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there for this last panel. And again, just to sort of echo my previous colleagues' comments on, like, I don't think I could have organised this as well as it has been. When I said, oh, can you book me a train here and here and here, it was like done like that. Like, I would not have done that quicker myself. So I really just respect how much work and effort has been gone into putting together such a great and well-organised conference. So as it was mentioned, I'm Lucy Hall, University of Amsterdam, and I have a PhD in international relations. A few times, I was once asked yesterday, are you a journalist? And I said no, but I'm starting to play around with writing more journalistic pieces, also in Dutch, in the Dutch media. And someone also asked, are you a lawyer? Also no. But my interest very much lies at the intersections of international law and power, with a particular focus on gender. So I also wanted to say, like, thank you so much to the colleagues before, because they've given such great empirical and contextual background to R2P. So it means that I'm probably going to skip over some of the things that I thought I would be talking about, because I don't want to repeat myself. But what I do in this presentation is look at how R2P as a normative framework, as a set of principles, has evolved in quite a dynamic fashion, how its meaning has evolved and how it's shifted, and that also there's an intertextual quality to R2P. So meaning that it didn't emerge in a vacuum, it emerged in conversation with other norms like the protection of IDPs, and also in conversation with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, of course, with Resolution 1325. And recently, we've seen a shift in the R2P landscape to it thinking about women and gender, to thinking about and making sense of reproductive rights in mass atrocity crimes. And I was just incredibly, like, I don't really have the words yet to explain how this morning's keynote also just completely just floored me. Not because what was discussed was new to me, like, as you'll see, like, this is exactly what I'm working on, but the strength in which it was discussed is just beyond the words that I have to explain right now. And I'm just very grateful and quite emotional today, not only because of what was mentioned in the keynote, but because we do find ourselves in a historical moment where, you know, the work that we've done as scholars and activists around protecting vulnerable groups and the prevention of genocide is becoming into very sharp focus. And I've had many conversations with colleagues, with students about, okay, cool that you can write books and articles and be published on preventing genocide, but what difference is that making right now? And I think that's why I've turned to thinking about publishing in newspapers and publishing in other avenues, because there is a sense of urgency that I have around talking about not only R2P and genocide prevention, but also talking about the ways in which genocide and other mass atrocity crimes are fundamentally gendered and frequently, if not always, involve aspects of reproductive violence. So that's where I'm sort of going today with my presentation. And this was sort of like the theoretical, empirical puzzle that I laid out for myself. So this is kind of coming from my PhD work, which I did finish in 2020. But in 2020, we also, of course, had shutdowns and lockdowns and COVID. And I also had a second baby. So, like, in terms of, like, being a productive member of the academic community, like, those two things combined really slowed me down. But I don't, you know, and for a long time I was really frustrated by that. I was like, oh, I really need to be publishing, and, like, you have this, like, post-PhD space and everyone's like, you need to get articles out, you need to write your book, and if you want to be a serious academic, like, these are the things that you need to do. And I was like, whoop, not happening. But I'm kind of okay with it, because what I've noticed in 2020, R2P has been doing some thinking around women. And 2020 was the year in which the Secretary General's report on R2P focused on women. Last year, 2022, I think, was a focus on children. And then this year, 2023, the focus on development. So there has been some interesting things happen in the R2P space while I've been parenting and surviving in a pandemic. Okay, so what I will do is build on the wonderful kind of foundational work that my colleagues laid out earlier today and ask the question in R2P, where are the women? So I'm going to start a little bit by talking about what have feminist academics said about R2P and where are the women. So in 2006, Jennifer Bond and Laurel Sherritt published a paper called A Sight for Sore Eyes, Bringing Gender Vision to the R2P Framework. And they were amongst the first to draw attention to the lack of consideration for gender in the first formulations of R2P. So with those foundational principles laid out in the ICIS report, I think before, like in the early 2000s, we called it the ISIS report, and then for obvious reasons, calling it the ISIS report became not done. But ICIS also just sounds weird to me. But yeah, the 2001 report, and also the research bibliography and background report. So all of this sort of like norm building, post-Kosovo intervention, document writing stuff that they did mentions women 3 times. And a lot of academics, myself included, were like, how at a time when 1325 was also passed at the Security Council in the same spaces as R2P, like a landmark resolution identifying and stipulating that questions of women need to be asked in relation to peace and security. Like, you cannot have peace and security without asking questions around women. And R2P at that time was just like, oops. Like, there just didn't seem to be much thinking about women and gender in the early days of R2P. Sorry, I just need to... Sorry, there's nothing worse than someone like blowing their nose into a microphone. And I think this is also something that I'm getting better at realizing, because like, I'm also just leaning into the fact that I think as academics we're taught to sort of like don't be emotional because people won't take you seriously. And I get that to an extent, but at the moment I'm also just thinking, if you're not having an emotional reaction to some of the stuff that we're hearing, then I have questions about that. But anyway, so back to R2P and women. So Hilary Charlesworth, of course, building on the work of Bond and Sherritt, writes that the lives of women appear peripheral to the development of R2P, except for the occasional references to protect women from mass atrocity rape. And I would say, in addition to Bond and Sherritt and Charlesworth in 2010, we've seen a sustained feminist interest in understanding the gender dichotomies, the gender discourses, and the ways in which women are either excluded or included, how R2P thinks of women, that has really become a consistent thread of the R2P landscape in academia. We, of course, have Eli Stamner's work from 2012, in which she asked the same question, where are the women? And what work is gender doing? And in asking these 2 questions, Stamner points out that there are 2 areas of clear relevance when it comes to R2P. The first is the literature on gender and mass atrocity crimes, and the second is the literature on women, peace and security and 1325. So I'll be focusing more on the gender and mass atrocity crime area gender and mass atrocity crime stuff today, but I think it is sort of interesting to reflect upon how this conversation also ricochets out into other protection norms. And I think this is, you know, if we're already thinking about like follow-up conferences or other ideas, that looking at how different norms are thinking about protection, that I think this is a really interesting area to put some intellectual effort into. So, I'm not going to go through these reports, but this is my empirical material. So this is every Secretary General report on R2P since 2010, starting with the early warning up until this year with development. I'm not going to talk about these in detail, mostly to sort of make the point that my analysis, my arguments are based on an analysis of all of this, and sort of tracing the ways in which R2P has thought of and articulated gender across this time and across these documents. And so based on this, I identify a series of 5 distinct but interrelated discourses. A discourse on women and children, a discourse on mass atrocity rape, a discourse on SGBV as an early warning device, a discourse on women as civil society actors, and the more recent turn that I'm noticing is a discourse on reproductive health or reproductive violence. And you'll notice I don't have civil society up here, and I've kind of dropped it for this focus, not because it's not relevant, but more because I've explored it in another paper together with Women, Peace and Security. Here is where I sort of dig a little bit deeper into these discourses. So for me, what is interesting is looking at not just how are women thought of, or how are men thought of in this space, but what are the assumptions that operate within these discourses to make sense. So I often sort of start at this point of entry, which is this idea that this women and children discourse relies on an assumption that women are always going to be referent maternal objects. The assumption that women as mothers are eternally peaceful and the eternal victim, but also that women's connection to politics and the law and their protection through the law is often mediated and contingent on that assumed capacity to give birth. This also, importantly, is a highly racialized, cis and heteronormative logic, because while I'm sort of saying here that there is this assumption around maternal peacefulness, maternal protection, that we know in times of peace and in times of mass atrocity crimes that the protections afforded to women because of their reproductive functions are not enjoyed equally. And you can look at the rates at which Black women in America are denied pain relief during childbirth and often bleed out and die because their pain is not taken seriously. I then sort of move through these dual kind of reflective logics of rationality and emotion, ones that I also play with myself as someone who is getting more comfortable with showing emotion in places where I should be the rational, objective scientist. Of course, ideas around reason, ideas around emotion are highly gendered, and they're very much connected to agency. They're very much connected to who and what gets taken seriously and who and what gets to act and gets to act with legitimacy. I then sort of move through these other logics of responsibility, and here is where I find it sort of gets interesting in relation to the 4 crimes that R2P is interested in, because we see this idea of responsibility sort of shooting out in a couple of directions. So mostly this idea of who is then criminally responsible for the 4 crimes that R2P is interested in preventing and responding to, who is responsible for protection, who is responsible for the prosecution of those crimes, and how do we do that? If we can sort of ascertain responsibility, then these questions of okay, then who does that becomes clearer, even though in practice it's obviously not that clear and highly politicized. But that's the logic of responsibility. Also something where you see masculine actors assuming the sort of idea of masculine protection enacted through either forms of military intervention or even in forms of I would say the ways in which the ICC has operated, particularly in relation to Libya, has also been this sort of paternalist, masculine, protective identity. Lastly, this idea of complementarity, and this comes up with this idea of women's organisations or women's groups in civil society are seen as supporting but not central when it comes to prevention, detection and response to mass atrocity crimes. And we see this sort of quite literally stated in the SG's reports about international assistance and R2P, which mentions that the efforts of women's groups complement more formal types of international assistance. And I would say that this is a particular assumption or function of women's organisations, of gendered work, that a lot of gendered work in the space of atrocity prevention and response is done with this idea that we're very interested in hearing from women and women's organisations, but the decisions to act the actions that are taken are still very much done in the masculine formal areas of politics. So women's actions and ideas are often seen as complementary rather than central, reproducing this idea that gendered logics of agency in which masculine bodies act or masculine bodies take responsibility. And by that, I don't necessarily mean like physical human masculine bodies, but like masculine international bodies like the Security Council, like UN peacekeeping missions, and that they take responsibility for feminine bodies who are protected and taken responsibility for. Okay, I'm gonna get less conceptual as we move on. And I'm gonna go over this bit pretty quickly, because I think these questions of like narrowing R2P to the 4 crimes, 3 pillars was like quite nicely covered by my colleagues before. And my main addition to this sort of like normative trajectory of R2P into its 2005 4 crimes, 3 pillars structure, that process has been gendered. And that process has been made possible by understanding how those 4 crimes, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity and genocide are carried out with gendered strategic objectives. But also that there is a normative appeal, there's like a consensus generating appeal to highlighting how these crimes are gendered. And by that I mean that women and children are positioned as the primary victims of atrocities for things like starvation, rape and displacement, and that sexual violence is constructed as significant, but only insofar that it occurs in conjunction with the 4 crimes. So while there are moments that R2P does acknowledge the relationship between structural gender inequality and mass sexual violence, it very much remains within the limits of these 4 crimes and at international, in the international criminal legal sphere. But I would argue, and again, I'm not sure, reflecting on where R2P is at the moment, and I share with the colleagues who presented this morning this sort of like optimistic but critical, like we're sort of like, let's not throw it out completely, but like, oh, there's still a lot of things that we need to figure out. And I very much agree with that, like let's not throw this out yet, but let's be asking questions about what possibilities does this present in terms of strategic litigation, in terms of advocacy, in terms of action, and what limitations does it also present? And this sort of leads me to ask this question of like, well, how does R2P think of reproductive rights, and how does it think of reproductive violence? Yikes. This is really why I need to discipline myself. Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, so what was very interesting in the 2020 report is that we do see a reference to compulsory birth control. And the term compulsory in relation to birth control is linked to the ways in which international law has come to articulate specific harms in relation to genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And following from this, within R2P's remit, the emphasis becomes protecting women from compulsory birth control rather than a broader reference to the provision of reproductive justice or safe and effective birth control. Because again, this sort of like narrowing makes us sort of think about, okay, well, where is reproductive justice as a broad concept and how does it fit into this narrow concept of the 4 R2P crimes? But I did find this excerpt from the 2020 report super interesting. So it says, strategies for protecting displaced women and girls, including the provision of life-saving sexual and reproductive health care, have to be fully integrated into atrocity policies and strategies. And like, there's a few things that I find interesting about this, but the first thing that strikes me is that they kind of qualify it in relation to displaced women and girls, as opposed to just like women and girls in general. Even though I do understand that when you are displaced, that sexual and reproductive health access becomes very difficult. But I thought, but if you're already displaced, how does that then link up to atrocity prevention? Because I think there is something there in thinking about how displacement, particularly in the ways that we see it connected to mass atrocity crimes, that if you have been displaced, that prevention hasn't happened. So I find this formulation really interesting. Yeah, and that sort of like became the space for me to then go, okay, well, what do we know in the law? Like, what has happened? So I would argue that we are in the midst of a series of violations of reproductive rights that constitute a crime against humanity and genocide. But this is not new, and we have jurisprudence that can guide a legal interpretation concerning reproductive rights and crimes against humanity. So of course we have in the Rome Statute the definition of forced pregnancy and forced sterilisation as crimes under international law. However, forced pregnancy has yet to be charged. Forced pregnancy has been charged once, and forced sterilisation has yet to be charged. The crime of torture under IHL may be applicable in relation to reproductive violence, where it causes severe physical and mental pain. And this was why when Zoe was presenting yesterday, that like my brain was like going off a little bit as well. So I thought, how does reproductive violence connect to not only physical but mental trauma and pain? And we've seen that prosecuted successfully in the ICTY. And the last example that I found really interesting was in the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal for Japan's military sexual slavery, which was a people's tribunal established by civil society in 2000. And in assessing the impact of these crimes, this will be my mic drop moment. So assessing these crimes, the tribunal paid close attention to reproductive harms, such as losing the ability to conceive, so losing the ability to have children, because of sexual and physical violence. So examples include when the victim experiences a miscarriage as a result of other crimes such as torture, forced labour, forced transfer or deportation, destruction of protected buildings including hospitals, and obstetric injuries. So in short, I think there is space within the existing legal framework to prosecute reproductive violence as a crime against humanity and possibly also genocide. And that when we're looking at indictments for war crimes anywhere, be it Gaza, be it the DR Congo, Syria, Ukraine, that we need to be thinking about reproductive justice. And I have some very brief conclusions, but I will leave it there because that was basically what I wanted to finish with an argument to say, let's start thinking about this because I think we've got the creative intelligence to move on this. And my sort of next phases of research will be asking questions around reproductive justice for queer and non-binary folks, but also how are men's bodies understood as reproductive bodies, and how is torture and crime and violence in mass atrocity contexts also could be understood as an act of reproductive violence against men and masculine bodies. I'll leave it there. Thank you.